In the spring of 1918, a locomotive left a factory in upstate New York in pieces. Not because it was damaged, not because something had gone wrong on the erecting floor. It left in pieces because there was no legal way to move it in one piece. The cab came off. The steam and sand domes came off. And the two enormous cylinders at the front were unbolted, photographed, crated, and loaded onto a flat car that traveled ahead of the machine it belonged to, so the whole assembly could squeeze through the tunnels and under the bridges between the builder and the railroad that had ordered it. That locomotive had to be rebuilt from a kit when it arrived. And here's the part that should stop you. That machine does not crack the top 5 on this list. It is number 8, because biggest turns out to be one of the slipperiest words in railroading. Longest is not heaviest. Heaviest is not most powerful. Most powerful is not the same as most locomotive riding on a single steel frame. Each of those crowns belongs to a different machine, and the men who built them spent 40 years fighting each other over the definition. But there is a thread running through all 10 of these giants, and it has nothing to do with ambition. Every single one of them ran into the same wall, not the limits of what engineers could design, the limits of the world the machine had to fit through. Number 10, the Soviet Union's 14-wheeled mistake. In the early 1930s, a delegation of Soviet engineers toured the American West and came home fascinated by a locomotive with 12 coupled driving wheels locked into one rigid frame, 6 driving axles, no hinge. It worked, so they decided to build one with 7. The result was designated AA-21, assembled in 1934 from components built in Germany, and it remains the only steam locomotive ever constructed with 14 coupled wheels in a rigid frame. It stretched more than 110 feet. The driving axles alone spanned 33 feet without a single joint between them. The physics were never going to cooperate. A rigid wheelbase that long cannot follow a curve. It has to force the curve to follow it. The locomotive bent rails outward as it passed. It shattered switch points. It could not fit the turntables on its own network, and when it pulled hard, it snapped the couplers behind it, because Soviet freight cars of that era were still linked by screw couplings rated for a fraction of that force. Engineers stripped the flanges off the 3 middle axles to let it slide through curves. It did not help. After a publicity run to Moscow in 1935, the largest rigid frame locomotive on the continent was quietly parked at a test facility and left there. It was scrapped in 1960 and nobody announced it. Number 9, the largest Garratt ever built, and it came from a workshop in Manchester. If you want to make a locomotive enormous without making it rigid, there is an elegant answer. Split it. Put the boiler on a cradle slung between 2 entirely separate engine units, each with its own cylinders and driving wheels, each free to pivot. The boiler ends up unobstructed by wheels above or below it, so you can make it as fat as the loading gauge allows. In 1932, a British builder shipped exactly that machine to the Soviet Union. Wheel arrangement 482 plus 2, 84. 262 tons in working order, 90,000 pounds of tractive effort. It was the largest Garratt anyone ever built, and the largest steam locomotive ever constructed in Europe. The cab was so vast, the floor measured 100 square feet. Crews could have played cards in it. It was shipped in crates to Leningrad, reassembled, sent east to the Urals, and tested successfully in temperatures that touched minus 41 degrees. 2 photographs of it working in Soviet service are known to exist, and then the official trial report came back scathing, for reasons historians still argue about since the machine had performed. The likeliest explanation is the least mechanical one. Buying more meant spending hard currency the state did not have, and lengthening every engine shed in the country to house them. It was retired in 1937 after 5 years and cut up. The biggest Garratt in history has no surviving photograph of its final day. Number 8, the locomotive with the largest cylinders ever fitted to an American engine. This is the machine from the opening, and the reason it shipped in pieces is sitting right on the front of it. 10 were built in 1918 for a coal railroad fighting a 2% grade in the mountains of West Virginia. They were compound mallets, meaning steam hit the rear cylinders first at full pressure, then exhausted forward into a second, much larger pair to be used again. Low pressure steam has less push per square inch, so the only way to recover the energy is with more square inches, which is how you end up with cylinders 48 inches across, 4 feet in diameter. They were so wide they had to be mounted at a slight upward angle just to clear the rails, and they remain the largest ever bolted to a locomotive in the United States. The boiler was the fattest ever put on a locomotive anywhere. And then there is the tender. Look at photographs of these machines and something seems wrong. The engine is monstrous, and the tender behind it is stubby, almost comically small. That was deliberate. The railroad's turntables were a fixed length, and the engine had already eaten most of it. The tender got what was left over. They worked coal drags uphill at about 8 miles an hour, and they did it for roughly 30 years. Not one was preserved. Number 7, the longest steam locomotive ever put on rails. In 1939, a railroad in Pennsylvania rolled out a single experimental passenger engine and nicknamed it the Big Engine, which was not creative, but was accurate. Overall, engine and tender together, it measured 140 feet, 2.5 inches. Nothing with a piston has ever been longer. Its driving wheels stood 7 feet tall. Its bed plate, cast as one piece, weighed nearly 50 tons. Its streamlined shell was styled by one of the century's most famous industrial designers, and it cost more than $500,000 in 1939 money, an absurd sum for one locomotive nobody intended to duplicate. It went straight to the New York World's Fair, where it was mounted on rollers and run at 60 miles an hour, in place, all day, in front of crowds. Getting it there was its own ordeal. It traveled by an indirect route and was towed part of the way because it did not fit the direct one. That was the whole problem in a sentence. This locomotive was too long for its own railroad. Once the fair ended, it was confined almost entirely to a single flat stretch of main line between Chicago and Ohio, roughly 280 miles, because most of the rest of the system had curves it could not physically take. It ran hard there, 10,000 miles some months. It was pulled from service in 1945 and scrapped in 1949. You will read that it hit 130 miles an hour, maybe more. No documentary evidence has ever surfaced. It reached a verified 101 with 1,350 tons behind it, which is remarkable enough without the folklore. Number 6. 3 engines, 1 boiler, and the most tractive effort anyone had ever measured. In 1914, a builder in Pennsylvania delivered a machine that made every other locomotive on Earth look provisional. It had 3 separate sets of driving wheels, one at the front, one under the boiler, and a third set under the tender itself, which meant the coal and water were not dead weight being dragged along. They were pressing down on driving wheels and contributing to traction. 6 cylinders, 850,000 pounds. When it was built, it was the largest locomotive in the world, and it was named after a well-liked engineer who had recently retired from the railroad that ordered it. On paper, it could outpull anything. In practice, it was defeated by arithmetic that nobody had run carefully enough. 6 cylinders, drink steam, and 1 boiler, however large, could only make so much. Above roughly 10 miles an hour, the machine simply ran out of breath. Worse, the exhaust from the rear engine left through a separate stack on the tender instead of the main chimney. Locomotive draft depends on exhaust being blasted up the stack to pull air through the fire. Divert a third of it elsewhere and the fire never burns as hard as it should, and as the tender emptied, it got lighter, so the rear engine progressively lost its grip. As a slow-speed pusher shoving trains up a grade, it did the work of 3 ordinary engines. That was genuinely useful, but when they tried to find its limit by hanging more cars behind it, they broke the couplers first. Only 4 of these were ever built, and all were gone by the mid-1930s. Number 5, the loudest locomotive North America ever operated. Skip forward 40 years, and one railroad decided the answer to horsepower was not a diesel engine at all. It was a jet. Not literally a jet, but close enough. A gas turbine spinning a pair of generators, feeding electricity to 12 powered axles spread across 2 permanently coupled units, with a converted steam tender behind them hauling 24,000 gallons of thick, heavy fuel oil that had to be electrically heated to 200 degrees just to flow. 30 of these sets were built between 1958 and 1961. 8,500 horsepower, 849,000 pounds, 179 feet from nose to tail, and more than 212,000 pounds of tractive effort, which is a bigger number than any steam locomotive ever produced. They earned their nickname honestly. Crews called them Big Blows, and they worked the emptiest country the railroad had, between Iowa and Utah, partly because the noise in a populated area was intolerable. Standing near one at full power was closer to standing beside an aircraft at takeoff than beside a train. What killed them was economics nobody forecast. They burned a residual oil that had been nearly worthless when the program started. Then refineries learned to crack that same residue into products worth real money, the fuel price climbed, and the advantage evaporated. The last of them ran in December 1969. To survive. If you are enjoying this, subscribe. We cover locomotive history and railroad engineering every week. Number 4. The biggest thing running today, and it is arguably cheating. Ask what the most powerful locomotive in the world is right now, and the answer comes from Russia. 4 sections, permanently coupled, built to work heavy freight over the mountain grades of the Baikal-Amur main line in the Far East, roughly 390 tons, more than 17,000 horsepower on the 1-hour rating, rated to move trains of 7,000 tons. Before it existed, that job took 2 double-section locomotives coordinated over a radio link. This machine collapses all of that into one crew, one throttle, one identity. Here's the honest asterisk. Is it one locomotive or 4 sharing a name? Every giant we have covered so far had to solve its own size. The frame had to hold. The boiler had to feed the cylinders. The whole thing had to fit a turntable. Modern practice sidesteps the problem entirely. If you need more, you bolt on another section. Its designers would say that is exactly the point. The engineering problem was solved by refusing to have it. Number 3, the largest diesel locomotive anyone ever built. In 1969, in an era when the standard road unit made 3,000 horsepower, one railroad ordered something twice that on a single frame. 2 complete diesel engines, 2 generators, 6,600 horsepower, and a frame 98 feet long. 47 were built. Every other railroad in North America looked at it and passed. Their reasoning was sound. If a single unit that big fails, you lose 6,000 horsepower at once in one place, possibly in a canyon. Spread the same power across 2 smaller units and a failure costs you half. The railroad that built them had one condition nobody else had, in the form of long, fast, sparse main lines through open country where fewer units meant fewer things to inspect and fewer things to break. They ran for a little over a decade before the fleet was retired. It is still the largest diesel locomotive ever constructed, and no one has come close since. Number 2, the heaviest reciprocating steam locomotive ever built. 60 of these were delivered to a coal railroad between 1941 and 1948, with 8 more going to a neighbor. 2666. Only 12 driving wheels, which sounds modest, until you understand where the weight went. Almost all of it went into the boiler. The firebox was 15 feet long. The design assumption was that if you could make steam fast enough, everything else followed, and it did. These produced around 7,500 horsepower, more than any American steam locomotive except one experimental design, and they did it at speed rather than at a crawl. The engine alone weighed 771,000 pounds in working order. Some records for the earliest batch put it higher. The lead driving axle carried 86,700 pounds, the heaviest axle load of any steam locomotive ever built, and that is a figure track engineers do not celebrate. There is a genuine argument, still running 70 years later, that these machines were a mistake. They cost nearly twice what a rival railroad paid for locomotives doing comparable work. And the railroad rarely loaded them to their capability, meaning an older, cheaper design from the 1920s could have handled most of what they actually did. To survive, both indoors, both enormous in a way photographs cannot convey. Number 1, the largest steam locomotive that actually worked. 25 were built between 1941 and 1944 for one specific job. A railroad needed to move 3,600 tons over a mountain grade in Utah without stopping to add helper engines at the bottom, and the arithmetic said that required 135,000 pounds of tractive effort. Everything about the machine followed from that number. To put that much force down without slipping, roughly 540,000 pounds had to sit on the drivers. Cap the axle load at what the rail could take, and you need 8 driving axles. 8 axles cannot sit in one frame and still take a curve, so the frame gets a hinge in the middle. 4884. The result measured 132 feet 9 inches, weighed about 1.2 million pounds fully loaded, and was designed to be safe at 80 miles an hour. Not because it would ever run that fast, but because building for 80 meant nothing would ever break at 40. The name was not marketing. An unknown worker at the erecting shop chalked 2 words on the smoke box of the first one during construction, and it stuck so completely that the railroad's own proposed name never had a chance. 8 of them still exist. 1 of them still runs. In 2019, after 5 years of work, a machine built during the Second World War moved under its own steam again, and it now hauls excursions across the same territory it was designed for. So which one is actually the biggest? The longest never fit its own railroad. The heaviest may have been more locomotive than the job required. The most powerful thing on rails today is 4 machines wearing 1 number. And the largest cylinders ever cast had to be shipped separately from the engine they belonged to. Every one of these giants hit the same ceiling, and it was never the ceiling of what could be designed. It was tunnel clearance, turntable length, curve radius, the strength of the coupler on the car behind. Engineers could always draw something larger. What they could not do was rebuild the continent around it. The next time you stand near a locomotive and it seems impossibly big, remember that it is not the size the designers wanted. It is the size the world would allow.